You're listening to the Outright Proud podcast. I'm Andre Duplessis and UN Program Director. At Outright International, we work together for better LGBTIQ lives. In this episode, we will be talking about the advancement of LGBTIQ human rights in Sub-Saharan Africa with our advocacy officers and partners. Here they are.
Welcome to Outright's podcast. I'm joined today by some wonderful, wonderful speakers, friends, colleagues, and activists that I have worked with for a very long time. And I will let them introduce themselves before we get into the topic of discussion for today.
So I'm Steve Litsike. I'm the Executive Director of Access Chapter 2, based in South Africa.
My name is Eve Odor. I work with the Gay and Lesbian Coalition of Kenya, now known as GALC+.
Hi, everyone. My name is Remy Makinde. I work for an organization called the Initiative for Equal Rights Tears. Tears is based in Lagos, Nigeria, and we fight for LGBT rights in the country.
So our topic of discussion today will be on activism in Africa. What are some of the successes that you have experienced, but what are the challenges that you are facing in the work that you're doing, advocating for LGBTIQ rights in the continent? And we would just like to hear from you all about the difficulties of the work, but also the successes of the work, because it's not all doom and gloom, right?
Well, in Nigeria, the climate for LGBT rights is quite stiff. We do have inherited criminal codes. And apart from that, we have penal codes that predominantly found in the northern part of the country. That is Kaduna, Kano, and a few other states in the country. But most recently, in 2014, we've seen the enactment of the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, which basically criminalizes the freedom of LGBT plus persons to freely associate with one another. And it also criminalizes the registration of gay organizations. One might wonder why this law exists. I mean, why do you have the SSMP, that is the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, when there's already an existing law that criminalizes same-sex relationship? I like to think that this is a work of the anti-gender movement, which is to increase discrimination against LGBT plus persons. Recently, in 2022, there was also an attempt to introduce a new bill, which was to criminalize cross-dressing. Although the bill did not pass through, it was, opposed at the House of Representatives. It doesn't mean that this bill could not be reintroduced. And this is just to give us context as to the challenges faced by LGBT plus persons in Nigeria. One of the important things to highlight is that the argument for the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act has been towards the fact that religious persons in Nigeria do not accept persons of diverse sexual orientation or gender identity. As a matter of fact, very few people have quoted progressive laws or LGBT rights as laws that are inherited from the Western part of the world. That is, it's a Western importation. But we did conduct a research in 2021 on religious fundamentalism that highlights that indeed Nigeria people are welcoming. We have diverse cultures, diverse identities in Nigeria. And in fact, what is or an imported culture would be the idea that gender is binary or that LGBT plus persons haven't existed before Nigeria was colonized.
Thank you so much, Remy, for your insights. And you mentioned something that's very critical, the fact that states that already have laws that criminalize consensual same-sex relations are putting in place laws to further that criminalization. And we have seen attempts of that happening in Ghana and most recently in Uganda. And Eve, now I'm going to turn to you and we will talk primarily about the struggle that has been in Kenya to decriminalize consensual same-sex relations, but also the progressive judgment that came in through the Supreme Court of Kenya on freedom of association. And of course, with that came the pushback.
Yes. So just to give a bit of context about Kenyan environment, for the past 10 years, the Kenyan context has been kind of a safe haven for East Africa. And this is because even though we did not have laws protecting us, for a long time, the court system was where we would get a bit of justice and a bit of retribution for the LGBTIQ plus community in Kenya. For example, laws around trans name change, laws around anal testing, cases like things like this are things that were won through the court system. So even when we were filing our petition to decriminalize and to get rid of the penal code, we already had an environment that was a bit accepting and a bit flexible. And this is why a lot of Kenyan LGBTIQ plus organizations were able to organize, mobilize, provide services for our communities that are left outside of the government structures. And for a long time, we had a vibrant movement. During COVID, when we went on lockdown, the anti-rights, anti-gender, anti-trans movement went into organizing. Because immediately we came out of that, the temperature had changed. The environment was different. Something was in the air. And the first real example of this is the backlash we've gotten from the registration ruling. I remember when we won the anal testing ruling, honestly, very few people cared. Right? Of course, our opposition, like our mainstream opposition, like Christian Professional Forum, were upset about it. But majority of Kenyans just continued with their lives. But when you see the current backlash from this registration case, which essentially just says LGBTQ plus people can organize just like any other Kenyan. The way women can form organizations, the way people who advocate for the rights of people with disabilities can form organizations, queer people can form organizations. That's it. But there's been such a huge uproar and backlash to the extent where they're now surveilling our organizations. They're now threatening to put bills in parliament. They're now circulating lists of LGBTIQ plus organizations and activists. Like they're doing any and everything to intimidate us. And this comes at a time where globally already there's a pushback towards advancements of rights for trans people. So there's a huge copy-paste from the anti-rights movement globally to what's happening in Nairobi and what's happening in Kenya at the moment. Definitely a worrying trend, because if they're copy-pasting the hate and they're copy-pasting the homophobia, the transphobia, it means that the source of the money is the same, right? It's a worrying trend. And yeah, so to answer your question, successes for the queer community in Kenya have been many, but right now we are afraid. They're starting to scare us a little bit. They're starting to bully us and to make it look like we are not allowed to exist and organize in the ways that we have been. And as a community, we must go back to the drawing board and re-strategize.
Thank you so much, Eve. I want us to touch a little bit on is the copy-pasting that is happening and the narrative, the homophobic and transphobic narrative that we're hearing across African countries. In Zambia, with the Women's March that happened, that all of a sudden, for some reason, became a pro-LGBTIQ march. We're definitely seeing this pushback spilling over even into the southern countries that we thought maybe were progressive. Steve, coming from South Africa, the space that is supposed to be legally protected, would you say that your laws are working for you in terms of protecting LGBTIQ plus individuals within that jurisdiction? And do you see a semblance of the opposition strategizing and organizing within the spaces that you're occupying and advancing rights of LGBTIQ plus people?
We have to acknowledge the fact that our history of apartheid did take a toll. And I think for many countries where there has been colonization in the past, for us having had this rooted into blackness, that you walk on a site, on the pave, you don't walk this direction, you don't use this door and so forth. So it was also deep-rooted racial discrimination. Now, you are looking at a history of prejudice on multiple layers, not only just on the base of SOGI. And all the time you have to wear an intersectional lens on how you navigate the environment, society, and so forth. And here we are just a little bit under 30 years in our democracy, where there has been that beacon of hope. And we are holding this constitution that is celebrated globally. You have Section 9 of the Constitution that says no one should be discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation, gender, sex, and many other grounds. Every right is articulated and is enshrined to give the element of hope, protection, fulfillment, and really to ensure that these rights are accessed in a dignified manner. Now, whether these rights are lived really, it's a big question that we are dealing with. But you cannot expect rights to be accessed where there has not been any healing. And I think that's what we are battling with as a country generally, because we see the backlash not only just of anti-gender movement, we're also seeing the backlash of the racial tension that still exists and is entrenched in society. It's entrenched with access to many other spaces. And it doesn't take away from what is happening against LGBTI persons, because we have, since the enactment of our constitution in 96, because language had to be negotiated, and we have people who organized before us really to fight even just that two words, sexual orientation, in trying to repair the injustices. And then you have many policies that were introduced post our constitution, whether you're talking basic employment conditions, whether you're talking Civil Union Act, whether you're talking Sex Change Act, many pieces of legislation. We have about at least nothing less than 12 pieces of legislations introduced to ensure the protection of LGBTI persons. And then you are talking about whether the constitution is practical, the policies are practical. Are they being implemented? Now you then look at the role of state, and then you look at other role players who are a part of this. And then that also speaks about society. And society is organized differently. It's not organized like the state. Society navigates what has been constructed. When you speak about social construction and what are those influences of social construction, and the influence of social construction are societal institutions. So yeah, I think if you look at the issues around social attitudes based on what has been constructed socially, and social construction is influenced by societal institutions, we have to think, one, religion plays a big role. Two, culture plays a big role. And sometimes, there's always arguments. We've got about 11 ethnic groups in South Africa. Okay, so whose culture are we talking about? And this is now where debates come. At what point? There was actually a couple of years ago, introduction of what we call the traditional bill. I'm glad even today that bill did not move far, and also not taking away the fact that we've got the House of Traditional and Quiescent in the assembly. So you can just imagine how easily there can be advancement of anything anti, because the House is already in Parliament and it can affirm itself and things can move. But I think with the constitutional protection, which is the highest legal framework we have in the country, that nothing can really surface in a way that suggests to marginalize anybody's rights for that matter. But socially, people win whatever they want to really organize around. And I think it's not only just applicable to South Africa, it's applicable everywhere. And it is why we see the homophobia and transphobia live through many of our countries. It lives in South Africa where we have legal protection. It's supposed to live in Nigeria, in Kenya, in any of the countries. So the question is, how do we deal with it? And how do we actually use different mechanisms to actually push back against any violation, any victimization, and also any thing that undermines the rule of law. And I think that's what we've been battling with across the world, for that matter. But I think we have a privilege as South Africa, but it shouldn't be the way where we say it's a privilege. It's how we're supposed to be everywhere. People are entitled to human rights by virtue of being human. And these rights, as we speak in different spaces, are universal. So what makes others feel that they are entitled to, and then others are not entitled to? So we are battling in the environment in South Africa a lot that has to do with hate crimes, homophobia, transphobia, more so from communities. And if you see it also from service delivery points or where people need to access services, you see it because the people providing it are members of society. So we mustn't disconnect those elements. We must be able to then say public servants actually doing what they are meant to be doing, and they leave their attitude, their behavior in the door, because that's what we've been doing. And I think also to realize what all of us are doing as human rights defender, we always constantly are working towards the protection for everyone. So that's our environment. But I think the last point that I want to say is we do also recognize that we have a role to play, not to only look at our own inner space as South Africa, but our role in the region in terms of solidarity, support, because any infringement of rights anywhere else, it's an infringement also on us.